I'm Chris Stafford, and this is episode 20 of AART, the podcast where we get to know the women behind their art.
If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll show you what I mean. If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll bring you to your knees. If you follow me.
My guest this week is American Vinnie Bagwell, a sculptor and representational figurative artist who has become a pioneer for African American women in her field. Her works of public art have become her raison d'etre as she strives to give a voice to underrepresented and enslaved Africans. Vinnie was born in Yonkers, New York in 1956 and grew up in the town of Greenburgh with her sister. Her parents, Edward and Viola Bagwell, were both artists in their spare time. As a child, she showed a gift for drawing and developed a passion for painting in high school. She graduated from Morgan State University in Maryland with a BS in psychology. Vinnie spent some time in car sales, which she said taught her communication skills. In 1993, she began sculpting, completely self-taught, and with ambition and purpose, it wasn't long before she was making a name for herself. Vinnie's first public artwork, The First Lady of Jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, located at the Yonkers Metro North Amtrak train station, was commissioned in 1996. She has since won numerous public art commissions and awards around the United States. Connecticut commissioned a 7-foot bronze of Hartford educator Walter Doc Hurley, which is the first public artwork of a contemporary African-American in the state. In 2012, Vinnie created a 24-inch bronze, Liberté, for the inaugural exhibition at the Freedom Rides Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. She's also a journalist and co-authored the book, A Study of African-American Life in Yonkers from the Turn of the Century. Vinnie is the co-founder, vice president, and executive director of the Enslaved Africans Rain Garden, whose mission is to honor, dignify, and restore the humanity of enslaved Africans in America by transforming them from objects to subjects through art in a public garden in Yonkers. Vinnie lives in Yonkers with her miniature French bulldog Rio. She has a daughter, Pierre, who is a midwife and artist. It was seeing Vinnie's magnificent 7-foot statue of the abolitionist Sojourner Truth at the entrance to the walkway over the Hudson River that introduced me to her work. Vinnie, welcome to the AART Podcast.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you here. As you know, I first found out about your work earlier this year when I met that beautiful statue of Sojourner on the banks of the Hudson River.
Yes.
And that was quite a sight. And I said to my friend who I was cycling with at the time, I said, I have to have Vinnie on the show. And here you are. So thank you so much for taking time to do this, because I know you have a very busy life. From the times that we've been in touch since then, you're leading quite a hectic schedule.
It's been very hectic. But I tell you, the fun thing about that particular commission was that her family came out the woodwork. I thought that was the most stunning thing. To receive a phone call that turns out to be Sojourner Truth's 5th generation grandson talking about, can I come over? Yes, that'd be all right. When do you want to come over? It's like, this Saturday. It's like, if it's okay with you, I think it'll be fine. Of course, he and I now are like the best of friends. This man has slept on my floor, at the foot of the sculpture. But, her family is littered with artists. He's a painter. He's a very good artist. His cousin, who at the time was 85, was the one who introduced him, to me. This is even before I started, working on the sculpture. They were just followers. You never know who's following you on social media. And so their family is littered with artists, which I think is phenomenal. And I think another interesting aspect of that meeting was that most people don't know that Sojourner Truth's family is married to Malcolm X's family. That's not common knowledge either. So, it's amazing what happens on these commissions. Harriet Tubman's 7th generation niece want to call me up mad because I invited her to the party so she could meet the Sojourner Truth's family. And I'm like, excuse me, do I know you? And so, you never think of these icons as having real families, still in our realm, and it humanizes them. It was really fun, to take Corey around and be like, this is Truth's fifth generation grandson for real. It would just stun people like, whoa. And so I think that's interesting how it's like the dots are being connected in public art or through public art these days.
And you're making a huge contribution to this.
I am so excited to be in a position to do that, yes.
Yeah, because it's interesting because Sojourner Truth's statue that we saw there across the Hudson River north of New York, she actually is from very close. I mean, stone's throw from there, isn't she?
Kingston. Yeah, it's not far.
And that is a story in itself. But I want to go back to the beginning because there are so many milestones, Vinnie. Milestones which could be, the statues of your life almost. Let's go back a little bit to where you got all your inspiration from, because you're a New Yorker through and through, aren't you? Born and raised in Yonkers.
I was raised in Yonkers till I was 10. And then we moved to Greenburgh. White Plains, if you're not in New York. If you're in New York, it's Greenburgh, town of Greenburgh.
And what were those very early days like then? Tell us a little bit about what Vinnie was like as a young child growing up there.
I was insular. I am legally blind, so I went to a visually handicapped class from grades 1 to 4. And my teacher, I had the same teacher all 4 years, Janet Nussbaum, and she recommended that my mother take me to the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary to improve my vision. So I was one of the first children to wear hard contact lenses. And because I am a born artist, I mean, as soon as they let me hold a pencil, I had things I wanted to create. I learned how to write very early, learned how to read early. I enjoyed being an only child. I have a sister who's 4 years younger than I am, but, I like playing by myself. I told myself stories. I'm a storyteller. And so, I always loved to read growing up. When I got to 8th grade, this is Greenburgh Central 7, Woodlands High School, the English chair, Tony Abramson, assigned herself to me as a mentor, and she challenged me to learn how to be a good writer. And so I took 10 Englishes in high school and came out a writing athlete. She said to me that, most people, when they grow up, they don't know how to write. And if you learn how to write really well, you'll always have a job. And it's true. I had another mentor in college. I went to Morgan State University, psychology major. My intention at the time was to become a psychotherapist, a clinician. By senior year, I was exhausted. I was like, nope, that's not what I want to do. And my mentor, who was the psychology chair, Dr. George Carter, suggested that I go to what is now Towson University and get an advanced degree in graphic design, publications design. I ran out of money, and so I had to come back to New York, and I got another mentor who was a graphic designer, and he's like, oh, you don't need to go to school. I'll teach everything you need to know. Harold Sanderson is 20 years my senior, a West Indian man, and he did. He taught me graphic design. He was an extraordinary graphic designer. At one point, he was the graphic designer for the city of New York. I mean, when I was a baby, probably, but the point of it is that he taught me graphic design, but he also taught me how to be self-employed, because at that time, I didn't know anybody self-employed. My parents' friends and my parents, these people all had jobs, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. A month worth of vacation was a goal. To be able to control your own time to, put in whatever you want to put in and get out whatever you get out. I didn't know anything about that. So this man taught me business, basically. And so I would sometimes be employed. I was a car salesperson for 10 years. I sold cars for 10 years. The fun thing about cars is that they teach you how to negotiate, and they teach you about game, how to spot game, because most people who come to buy a car, they've got game. We got game, they've got game. I sold clothing. I worked for Nordstrom's for 7 years, men's sportswear. I love men's clothing. I didn't start sculpting until I was 36. So the reason was because the previous year, I had discovered that I had a block. Like I'm a painter, a good one. And I hadn't painted in 7 years, and that blew me. Like, how did that happen? Had I not known that was happening? And the thing of it is, I was busy working. I was working, trying to make money, doing stuff. And so I had gotten away from making art with my hands. I was still being creative. I was writing a book, the study of African American life in Yonkers in the turn of the century was a book about the history of Black people in Yonkers. I worked on a book for my family. I had a lot of stuff. I was always creative and, doing extracurricular things. But somehow I had gotten away from painting and I didn't know how to get back because I'm untutored. It's not like I went to school and learned technique. I just kind of think of things. And
kind of things were you painting, Vinnie, then?
I do people, I draw people. I paint people. I sculpt people. And so I only do people. I mean, I can do whatever I want, but, you leave me to it. I'm doing people. And so a friend of mine had a husband who was a potter. And one day he brought over some plastilina and some sculpting tools and said, maybe you like sculpting. And like everybody else, I was like, how do you do that? And so, he showed me this tool works like this and this one kind of does that. And it's the wrist action. And, of course, I'm sitting there trying to figure out what? It's kind of like when somebody's trying to teach you how to drive a stick. It's like, what? And so he left me, and 4 days later, I had a sculptor. Like I had been sculpting all along. And, I called up his wife, and, we're on the phone squealing and carrying on. And, I'm like, I don't have any money, because this guy wanted money. And so she brought him over. And, he's looking at it. He's like, you sculpt better than me. What do you want me to tell you? And I was like, I don't know. It needs something. And so he says, well, you've got the head turned like on an angle. There's a great big tendon in the neck. I'm like, oh, yeah. So, he challenged me to really look at people, like really, really look at people. One of my friends that I made later on, Barbara Siegel, who's a stone carver, taught at the School of Visual Arts. She's like, how are you teaching yourself how to sculpt? Nobody does that. And I'm like, what's happening to me? And so, and she was like, well, I think you should take a class on anatomy. And, shortly after I met her, she took me to see Bruno Lucchesi. Bruno Lucchesi is a world-renowned sculptor. He's Italian. And at the time, he had a studio down in Soho on St. Mark's. And I walked in there, and I was just like, I was dumbfounded at the door because everything that's in his books is in his studio. And so, Barbara's saying to him, don't you think she needs to go to school? He's like, no. Don't you think she needs to take a class in anatomy? Don't you think she needs to study art history? He's like, no, they're wrong. I'll leave her alone. She already has an eye. He said, all she has to do is sculpt. To make art, she's going to get better every time she makes something. You'll see. And so fast forward, that's pretty much how it happened. In my second year of sculpting, I wrote a proposal to the city of Yonkers to do Ella Fitzgerald.
This is a really interesting milestone in your career, Vinnie, because how did you have the confidence to do that? Someone who's self-taught and a young woman breaking into the art, if you will, have the confidence to say, I'm going to go to the city of Yonkers and tell them they need a statue of Ella Fitzgerald.
The same way I say to you, would you go to the mailbox and get your mail, please? You just decide that you're going to do something and you do it. The mail is there, so you're going to get it. And you're like, I'm going to get the mail. I'm going to bring it back inside. I learned that the city of Yonkers received money from HUD every year for community development programming. And my first grant was for the book that I wrote, Study of African American Life in Yonkers in the turn of the century. In the process of doing the work for the book and having to comply with the agreement with the city of Yonkers to do that, I learned about funding, grant funding. And so I knew that this grant was available. And I was at this point, I'm sorry, I left out an important thing. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm writing for the newspaper. The Nut Suburban newspaper offered me a job. I went to them, wanted them to do an article about my artwork and they offered me a job. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so my job was to write stories about Yonkers. It could be about anything from any angle. They didn't care. It just had to have a tie-in with Yonkers. So I wrote these really cool articles that people seem to love. Because I like to talk about stuff that nobody else was giving any attention to. Like, do you know what landfill is? Do you know what this is? Do you know this is here? Did you know that this bakery has the best baked goods in the county, and they also send stuff to the White House? Did you know? So I was doing that, and of course, people were flocking to me because they wanted coverage. And if you had a really good story and I liked it, I would cover it. So point of it is that City of Yonkers knew me. I wasn't a stranger. I should say that as well.
Right.
And so Barbara had started a group of artists and they wanted to do some things and they didn't know how to do anything. They didn't know what to do. So in the process of me interviewing them about what they wanted to do, I was like, I can help you. So I'm the person who became the grant writer. So, grant writing at that point, I hadn't done it before, but it wasn't that hard. It's like read the instructions and follow them. That's it. It's like, whatever you're asking for money has to fit the matrix. That's just a very simple game, and so, we got the first funding, and with the first funding, the name of the organization was Art on Main Street. The first funding created these sculptural benches that we put down on the waterfront. We gave 9 kids jobs. And the New York Times rides the train every day because Yonkers is on the waterfront and the Metro North Hudson goes right by, us. And so one day the editor really wanted to know what we were doing and decided to get off the train to find out, what are you doing? When he found out what we were doing, he wrote like a full-page article on the kinds of stuff that we were trying to do in this particular project. So the second cycle's coming up and they're so busy doing that nobody's looking at the second cycle. So I'm like, well, I'm going to write a proposal for Ella Fitzgerald. And of course it got in. City of Yonkers did not give me all the money. They gave me a fraction. And of course the question now is, how am I supposed to do this with a fraction of the money? And the foundry said, well, we're going to help you. And they basically crapshooted on me. Their attitude is, if we give you 1, you are going to get 2. And that's when we start to get paid. And of course, now I'm doing 3 and 4 a year, and it's high 5 every year. It was an investment for them. They're like, no, she's passionate about her work. She's actually pretty good. And we think she's going to fly. But in the public art arena, most people don't realize because they don't have any friends that are sculptors. The public art arena is a white patriarch arena. It is basically by and about white men. And it's been that way for centuries. If you're going to talk about figurative, representational sculpture in this country, there's probably now possibly close to 6,000 sculptures. 95% of them are done by white men, about white men. Very few are about women. Very few are done by women, and even fewer are done by people of color. So at that time, there really was nothing going on. I'm looking around and I don't see anything, and I'm thinking I could make something. And of course, about having been a salesperson selling cars, closing. It's like, what could I say to make them say yes? And so Ella Fitzgerald made sense because she grew up in Yonkers. Like I said, it's like deciding that you're going to go to the mailbox and you're going to the mailbox. It's like, this makes sense to me. I'm going to go do that. And so, they'll say yes, they'll say no. And again, when you work as a straight commission salesperson, understand it. And that's a big thing right there. When you work as a straight commission salesperson, your life depends on your ability to get people to say yes to you. And I need you to say yes now. Not next week after you talk to your wife. Not tomorrow after you've thought about it. I need you to say yes right now. Where's your credit card? I don't see it. And so you learn how to be courageous, confident, cocky, whatever you want to call it.
But have the confidence in your work that you could take on such an important person.
A lot of stuff that you learn in straight commission sales. And, when you're selling high-end cars, I'm talking about Acura, Lexus, Honda when Honda was going for $2,000 over a sticker. How am I going to convince you to buy a car for $2,000 over a sticker? I got to be really good to do that.
Yeah.
How am I going to keep you from pivoting and walking out on me? Wait, where are you going? Wait, hold on a second. We're talking here. You just walk away from me. I understand you. And you're screaming, I don't know the pay. I said, well, wait a minute. You asked me what's the price. That is the price. Can we talk about it? Come inside. Let me get you a cup of coffee. Calm down. Come on. Wait a minute. In that business, in that kind of business, you have to learn about people. You have to learn how to understand people and how people make decisions. And again, if you have a goal, a decision that you want somebody to make, the question is, what's the route to that decision?
It sounds like this was a superpower of yours then, Vinnie.
I mean, in that case, I got a bunch of superpowers, but the point of it is that in the car business, again, I'm going to use that as the frame of reference, and just about every job I've ever had is a reflection of that business. It's dog eat dog, first bite counts. It's like, listen, I want to eat every day. I want a nice roof over my head. I don't want to have to ask people for help, for money. I want to take care of myself. That's what motivates you. By that time, I had a little girl. I got to pay for daycare. Do you know how expensive shoes are for kids when their feet grow every 3 months? You know what I'm saying? It's like, what do you mean? It's like you do it. This is what we now call adulting. We didn't have a word for it back then. Now I would say this falls in the realm of adulting. At any rate, the point of it is that I began to write grants and develop programming for Art on Main Street, and I did that for 4 years. You know, Ella, of course, went up. It turned out to be the first sculptor of a contemporary African-American, the first sculptor of a contemporary African-American woman to be commissioned by a municipality in the United States. That was interesting.
That was fantastic. Yes.
I mean, the commissioner for public art for the city of New York, Marshall Warfield, calls me up like Monday after Ella died to tell me this. And she was stunned because, you know, back then we didn't have the internet, so our communication system was nothing like it is now. And she wanted to know, wait, how did you win this? I didn't hear about this. How did you win this? And I told her, I said, I asked for it. Yeah, but I mean, I'm sorry, did I tell you who I am? You know, I am the repository of the largest public art collection in the country, and I should have known about this. I said, well, I don't know what to tell you. Well, who was on the design committee? I'm like, what design committee? She's like, oh, this is so hokey. I'm like, no, hokey is working for me right now. Okay, you know what? I got Ella Fitzgerald in my living room. She says, yeah, but it can look like me. I said, but it doesn't. You want to see it? I would love to see it. I said, it's coming to the Foundry in Manhattan on West 26th Street between 6 and 7 on Thursday. You want to come Friday? Yes. I said, okay. Can I bring somebody? Sure. I'm bringing John Roden. I said, okay. She said, do you know who that is? I said, no. She said, oh my God, you're so hokey. The point of it is that I'm sculpting for 2 years and it's Ella Fitzgerald.
I'm assuming that you were a very big fan of hers then.
Look, my mother dated her brother, okay? I mean, the point of it is that I knew of her for the better part of my life because my mother knew her. And, you know, there were lots of people in Yonkers that knew her. And then, you know, of course, my grandmother played her music, so I knew her sound. I remember seeing her on TV a bunch of times. You know, I mean, I knew her. I mean, vicariously through other people who actually knew her. I was disappointed when I realized that she was blind and would never see the artwork. And then she died in the middle of it. You know, so that was that. But then, you know, fast forward, I moved to Maryland for 10 years. And during that time, it was just really, really difficult because, again, how do you find this kind of work? In 2003, one of my cousins who lives in Harlem told me that the city of New York was commissioning a sculpture of Frederick Douglass in the Northwest Corner. I applied for that. I didn't win. I ultimately, the Frederick Douglass Museum and Cultural Center, which is in Highland, New York, which is right next to Annapolis. There are only 2 cities in the county of Arundel County. But anyway, the point of it is that they have his summer home. That's where they're housed. And they wanted the maquette for the summer home. So I sold it to them. BET paid for it, which was really wonderful. And ultimately, in 2007, Hofstra University put out a call for a public art that represents the history, the achievement, and the aspirations of people of color. And the budget was $185,000, and I scoffed at that. But I'm like, you need another zero. Ultimately, a couple of days later, I'm like, let me read that again. And I was like, that's like no money. I said, I could do one person with that. And so I had to think, if I had to have one person represent me, who would I represent me as a colored person? I'm like, I really love Frederick Douglass, because by that time I had learned a lot about him, just, his eloquence, his passion, his intensity. I just loved him. And so I said, the sculptor that I designed for the Northwest corner of Central Park actually fits that matrix, because the speech in his hand says, until the American people stop using color as the bar measure for respectability, this discussion must go on. And then, of course, he rants. So I said, okay, wait. So I'll make the rest of the speech go around the apron. I'll do it like that. So I submitted it and I won. So that was my second public art commission at Hofstra on California Avenue. By this time, I moved back to New York. And I had won another commission to do something for Memphis. So that was my third one. It's a sculpture that represents African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans. And again, these were my first two sculptures where I started using bas relief to extend the narrative.
And which you do so beautifully.
I decided to make that be my thing. By the time I did the third sculpture, because I did it on the back of Frederick Douglass's chair. By the time I did the third one, I was like, okay, I'm gonna make this be my thing, because I was trying to figure out, like most artists, it's like, how do you create a signature? How do you look at a sculpture and know it's a Vinnie Bagwell? What is it? And I'm looking at other sculptures. First of all, there's nobody else black. It is impossible to find anybody black back then. The internet still hasn't been created. It's like, it's impossible. It's like, am I the only one?
And you were the only one.
I don't know. I guess. I don't know. There were other people. I didn't know them. I mean, it was a long time before I knew them. I think the first person that I met was Ed Dwight, At any rate, the point of it is that you can still count them on two hands. But the point is that I decided, when I came back to Yonkers, I looked around and, Yonkers is, it's evolving exponentially right now, but back then it was still kind of evolving at a snail's pace. And, there were still people in office, I knew everybody. I came home, I'm like, oh, Vinnie, how you been? Great, how are you? And so I wrote a new proposal to them to create a sculpture garden to celebrate enslaved Africans. And in the process of wanting to do that, I discovered that 6 of the first enslaved Africans to be manumitted in this country came from Yonkers. I'm like, oh, that's important. So that became my thing. Like, yeah, that's important, And so, I raised $50,000 and the city of Yonkers matched me, and I created 5 bronzes and an exhibition that traveled. And, basically just decided to try to beat the bushes to get this thing funded. I thought it was important. I thought that other people would see that it was important. I'm like, no. And so when they asked me at the beginning of time, how long do you think you need? I'm like, 10 years. And they were like, 10 years. I'm like, do you know how fast 10 years goes by? It goes by so fast, make your head spin. I said, and you got 5 sculptures, so you figure you're not going to win every cycle, so hopefully every other year we'll win something. Let's see how it goes. And so it was wonderful. It wasn't easy, but it worked out. So last year, I installed it. And, it's interesting. It is what I told them it would be. It is a destination. People call me, email me, inbox me, messenger me, and tell me that they're coming. And, I live around the corner. So I'm like, well, let me know when you come. You can come over. So I let strange people in my house all the time. During that period where I was creating that project, I would have what I call previews. Like every time I finished the sculpture, I would have like a massive party in my house. I live in a building that used to be a trolley barn, so I've got a large amount of space, and it's quite impressive when you walk in because I've got 18-foot ceilings, and most people have no idea what's inside this building because most people, they don't know somebody in this building, they have no reason to be in this building, so they don't know what this building is. And so I would have these great parties. I would buy invitations, send out invitations to all the political people and to community-based organization heads and, organization directors and whatever the case may be. And, it'd be like an old-fashioned soiree parlor kind of thing, with really good food and wine and just kind of hang out and talk to each other and laugh and talk about how wonderful the work is. And so, I wanted to create something that never happens. Like that doesn't happen. Nobody else has really done it the way that I did it. And so, it made, of course I believe in documentation. So I hired professional photographers and videographers and, I used every medium. One of my Facebook friends, Ty Grael, turned out to be a wordsmith. He came to me early on and I commissioned him to create these audio stories for me. And then I have my daughter create films on them. So if you go to my YouTube page, Vinnie Bagwell, my YouTube page is organized. You can kind of scroll down and by the project, see whatever videos were made about that project. So for the Rain Garden, there are 5 stories, where we tell you who these sculptors are. I humanize them. This was the purpose of creating this kind of work, to humanize Black people. We're always vilified or, it's just amazing, what has happened. And you try to remind people that racism is a learned behavior, that there really is no such thing as race. There is not. Race is a man-made construct, and racism is a man-made construct, and it was made for economic development. It's about money and greed. That's all it is. And you have to remind people of that because some people drank the Kool-Aid. They got it wrong. It's like, no, try to remember what this really is. And the question is that how you want to be about your life? And so it's an ongoing battle. Racism is as prevalent as it ever was. The difference now is that the people who are not racist are more verbal. And, there's this balance that, we're trying to achieve. And it's an ongoing fight. The fun thing is that public art helps. So now, particularly since Ferguson died in 2020, that was the beginning of what I call the revolution, when the whole world co-signed and said, America, stop jigging with the Black people. All right already, stop it. America pulled up and was like, whoa. And, municipalities all over the country started looking at their portfolios and realizing, yeah, we look real racist. We don't have nothing about Black people, brown people. We just got dead presidents and war heroes and Confederate stuff. That was just amazing, because originally, in the late, 1800s, public art was used propaganda for, racism and slavery and stuff. They put up their, their kings and their generals and their whatever. And all of a sudden, and it seemed like it happened all at once. Actually, it was going on for quite some time. It's just that it came public because the media picked up on it. People realized we don't really want to look racist, particularly if we're in the middle of economic development. Black people's money is green too, At any rate, the point of it is that there is a revolution going on nationwide where communities are starting to look at themselves and look at their history, and they're realizing that there is merit in telling the stories of other people besides white people. So now you have all these new calls for art, which is exciting, extremely exciting. I've had some really great opportunities. I did the first sculpture of a contemporary African American for the state of Connecticut. Walter Doc Hurley was he was a educator. and a philanthropist. This man raised enough money to send more than 500 kids to school. That's a big deal. You know, the white people in Connecticut had a bit of a tantrum about that. And they were like, well, why are you putting him up there? You know, why don't you do Marian Anderson? I was like, why don't you do Marian Anderson? At any rate, what's wrong with doing an educator? And by the way, somebody found the funding for that. So that's what we're doing. You know, and by the way, you still haven't done Marian Anderson. You know, what are you going to do? At any rate, the point of it is that there are just some stunning stories. You know, contraband. I did a public art project for the District of Columbia. At this point, I've won 4 Department of General Services, commissions. You know, they wanted me to do something for one of the elementary schools, which is near the World War II, or it's near the Civil War Museum on, R Street in Northwest. And the question was, why do they want to use public art for a walking tour? And I discovered the concept of contraband. And when I asked people, do you know what contraband is? And people were like, no. It's like, so because Black people were not considered people, they were considered chattel. It's kind of like, you know, you're at war and here's the line between Virginia and the District of Columbia, and you leave your cannon too close to that line, you go to sleep, I'm taking that cannon, that's my cannon. I said, you got 40,000 Black people trying to escape slavery into the District of Columbia. When they hit the District of Columbia, they became contraband. Isn't that interesting? That's how I won that commission. They said, you went so far back. We were just like, what? We didn't know that. Let me put the call out. Like, you went back past what we were talking about. That's the interesting aspect of the history. I'm just simply saying, you know, and mind you, this contraband camps were all over the country, like not just the District of Columbia, but there was like a line between the North and the South where if you came into certain states, I'm sorry, those are my slaves now. You can't have them back. Nope. You know, you want to go to war about it? We can go to war about it, but they're mine now. You know, and so that's how a lot of people got to freedom. This country is so wild. I mean, it's just the stuff that has gone on here. That's still going on here. It's just off the chain. You know, the idea is to try to unlearn hate, you know, to try to help, well, the new people to understand the truth and to say those aren't goals.
I'm interested, you talk about the African-American history, Vinnie. This must go back to early days of your childhood, I would imagine. When did it start really to match the beat of your heart, so to speak, and you realized that this was something that you were going to have a purpose in life?
There are a myriad of artists who have set examples in other mediums, and we're all on the same mission. You know, you've got the actors, you know, who perform in plays like, I'll just say, August Wilson plays. You have people who make movies like Tyler Perry, you know, Duvernay. There's a bunch of people now who are telling the stories. We're all storytellers. Everybody that's doing this work, we're all storytellers, and we're all telling stories in a variety of mediums. So, you know, I'm working in sculpture. There are people who paint the same stories that I'm talking about. They use painting, murals the same way. You know, as I said, you know, it's easy to see in the music. There are some people, you know, how I won the Marvin Gaye Commission for the District of Columbia. You know, I went back and told the history of Marvin Gaye and what's going on. It's like the What's Going On album was the milestone in his career. He went from being a sex symbol to being somebody who was about something serious. You know, he's telling his brother, who's in the Vietnam War, about what's going on in Kent State, and his brother's telling him about death and war. And he's like, what's going on? Oh my God. So he wrote this anthem. And no, Berry Gordy really didn't want him to put that out. And so, I mean, Marvin was like, if you don't put this out, I'm not going to sing another song. And somebody helped him leak that song onto the radio. And of course, it caught fire. And then, of course, after it was embraced, you know, then Berry Gordy says it's a wonderful thing. But the point of it is that he felt a certain responsibility to say something. And he used his platform to do it. You know, there are a lot of actors who are doing the very same thing. You know, it's like, you know, when things got strange in 2020, there were a lot of actors, black and white, who stood up and said something. Like, hey, you know, the point of it is that there are those of us who feel responsible. I mean, I don't think that it's random that my father grew up in the South and that I spent my summers there. You know, when I watch Tyler Perry movies, I holler because I know what he's talking about, because I lived that culture. I grew up in that culture. You know, when you talk about civil rights and things like that, I met Martin Luther King. He came to my church when I was 7. I shook his hand. He said something to me. You know, the point of it is that when he died, I took it personally because I just met him last year. You know, and so point of it is that, you know, you grow up with a certain set of experiences and mores. And, you know, in the final analysis, I think, you know, one of the biggest influences, having gone to a historically black school, you know, at Morgan State University, and I'm almost certain they still teach this some kind of how, you know, they tell you, you have a responsibility as a black person to do well, that mediocrity is not acceptable, and that in your process, you should try to figure out a way to help your community and uplift the race. They talk like that in my school. I'm talking about every day. That was the message. You come to class without your homework, oh, you're going to get a lecture about that. You know, it's about being serious about your life. It's like, what is your purpose? Who are you? What are you doing here? What's your contribution? How are you going to make yourself be of service? And again, you know, I mean, Martin Luther King had a speech. It's like, oh, you don't have to go to college to be of service. You don't have to make your nouns and your verbs conjugate properly. You don't have to have a degree. You just have to want to help somebody be better, a better human being. That's all. And that is pretty much the point. Otherwise, what are you doing here? You're just going to be self-serving your whole trip? Really? That's your plan?
Did your parents instill this as well as in school? Did this come from home as well?
No, my parents did not talk like that. My parents had jobs. They were hardworking. You know, they made sure that we had what we needed. And, you know, they were about family, basically.
And were they storytellers?
Oh, my God. Yes. My family is very gregarious. I mean, you come to a party or you come to a cookout or you come to a funeral or a wedding, there are going to be stories, you know. I think everybody tells stories, you know. The question is, how do you tell the stories and what makes a good story, you know? And so, you know, this is kind of what translates into my artwork. It's like, okay, you know, example, I am a finalist for W.E.B. Du Bois for Great Barrington. They say they're having a hard time making a decision, and they're making the decision coincidentally today. Let's see what they do. But the point of it is that, like most people, I know that W.E.B. Du Bois was a writer, and I know that he was the one who, you know, founded or co-founded the NAACP. That's about all I knew at the beginning of it. So now I got to really figure out what's the best story that I can tell about him through my work. So I discovered, and again, I had to delve, I discovered that, of course, you know, we all know that, you know, he was the original editor of the Crisis magazine. What I didn't know was that the Crisis magazine was a vehicle that got a whole bunch of Black Renaissance writers started. So, for instance, Langston Hughes first published The Crises. Zora Neale Hurston first published it. You know, Claude McKay. There's a whole bunch of name brand and not so well named, you know, known names that got their start or got their reputations because of that magazine. So I decided to highlight that. So I got 15 faces on his back in low bar relief. They want to know, can I remove some of the faces? I'm like, so wait a minute now. And this is again, this is about depth. I'm sorry. When you Google who did he influence, they list 15 major people. Now, just because you don't know who they are Doesn't mean they're not major. It just means you don't know who they are. I tell you what, you tell me who to throw out. Who you want me to throw out? Because here's what's going to happen. Later, somebody who might be a historian is going to look at that sculpture and they're going to understand what I call myself doing. They're going to notice that, oh, there's 4 people missing. Why? And there's not going to be any notation on it that says, oh, the selection committee said it was too many faces. You know, so I said to them, if you don't want 15 faces in the back, well, then what do you want in the back? Tell me what you want. I'll put it there.
I'm just wondering, in terms of productivity, it's very demanding of you physically as well. So how much can you take on at any one time?
I'm pretty much, I think, at the max right now. Right now, there's an 8-foot woman in my house. I've got the Reverend James Lawson in my house. You know, I say to people, do you know who the Reverend James Lawson is? Do you?
No, I don't.
Okay, so here's the thing. So people think that Martin Luther King was friends with Gandhi and that he got his whole nonviolent thing from Gandhi. That is not true. The Reverend James Lawson was in India studying with Gandhi. He was friends with Martin Luther King. And then back then, there was a whole bunch of them that were friends, just like Martin Luther King was friends with my minister here in Yonkers. The point of it is that the clergy was very much at the front or the forefront of the Black community. These were the brokers for the Black community. And they were trying to broker for better relations, whatever, because we were, again, fighting racism and segregation and a whole bunch of stuff. So everybody's talking to everybody, trying to figure out strategies. And Lawson's in India telling Martin Luther King about Gandhi. He tells him, well, then you need to come back here and teach the children. That's what they call the college students. You need to come back here and teach the children that. And he's like, well, I'm in the middle of it right now. He said, yeah, but you need to come back. But I'm busy. He's like, you need to come back. And he came back and he picked up, quote unquote, 8 children. The most notable of them, John Lewis. He was the mentor to John Lewis. He was the mentor to Marion Barrier, Darian Nash. There was 8 of them. And then, of course, this was the war general for all of the major marches. This is the guy who coordinated the March on Washington, the Selma March, the Sanitation March, the Freedom Rise March. This is the guy. He's the war general. And if you saw his picture, if you Google his name, you're like, I've seen that guy. I just didn't know his name. Nor did you know of his importance. He grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and Penn State Fayette is putting the Sculptor of Him in their library. He's 92 years old. His mind is still crystal, and he's the same guy. It's really cool talking to history. I'm here to tell you, I'm on the phone with this guy for an hour, and he's throwing around names like nobody's business. Yes, I told Jesse, get up and go get Martin. Let's go get some coffee. We got to work this out. I mean, I'm listening to firsthand stories, and I'm just on the phone grinning like, oh, my God. At any rate, the point of it is, it's a great story. His is a great story. And there are 30 people on him. And I'm saying to the people in Great Barrington, you are missing the point. They want to know, can I make him more inviting? I'm like, what do you mean? Well, you know, I have him sitting there. He's sitting there with his legs crossed like he used to do, talking about W. Du Bois, and he's reading. And it's like if you were sitting at the library and you're waiting for somebody to come and you're reading something and you turn to look and you see if they're reading, like, hey, they're like, that doesn't look very inviting. We think that his hand to be out welcoming them. I'm like, W. Du Bois would never do that. I mean, if you read about his temperament, that's not, he might do that, but I don't know to whom. Okay, fine. What, you want to send me a picture of what you mean? We were hoping you could send us a couple of sketches for free. I don't think so. Over the weekend? No. That's a whole nother talk show. First of all, artists receive so much disrespect. It's just unbelievable. It's just normalized. And we want to eat every day like everybody else, so we comply. I'm so old now, and thank God I am so flush now. I can shove somebody back and say, you know what, you're biased. I can say that. It's the truth. If the shoe fits and it's ugly, it's not my fault. If I say to you, you asking me to work for free over the weekend, you know what I'm doing this weekend? I'm going to see Santana this weekend. I'm not going to be thinking about you. I'm finished. Already submitted. Make a choice and pick a winner and then go to Final Design and pay that person to make another version that pleases you. I've done my job. How dare you come back to me and expect me to do more for nothing? I'm sorry, I'm putting it out there. I'm just saying that happens. Oh, well, I called around and I heard that's normal. That doesn't make it right. I can say something and it's like, oh, stop me and correct me if I got it wrong, because that's the conversation that we had. And I'm saying it happens all the time.
Do you see that this impact that, you know, that you're now in a position to empower other, particularly women, but people of color, do you see that when you go into a room now? Do you see young women, particularly women of color, step up now and feel emboldened by your work?
I think that the biggest challenge for artists is not, understand about artists. First of all, on a regular day now, most artists judge one another not based on color. We base our judgment on what do you do. It doesn't matter if I'm a sculptor and you're a saxophonist. We're like cousins. It's a race. Artist is a race of people that are highly favored by whoever runs this joint. I guess they kiss on the forehead before we leave out. They give us a gift before we leave out the door. Point of it is that we're not like the others. We're not. We come here with superpowers. We come here with abilities. And the question is, what is the responsibility that comes with your power? A lot of artists, because sometimes it's lonely when you're young, because maybe you're the only one in your family. Now, if you come from a whole boatload of family with talent, like for instance, you'll see talent run through family of musicians, like all the kids are musicians. The Marsalises is an example. The dad's a musician, the kids are musicians. There's a lot of families that are like that, but there are a lot of people who are the only one. Like there's nobody else but me. They don't have any friends that are artists. And they're talented, and they are told that they're talented because they really are. And some of them go to art school, you know, and the question really is, how compelled are you? A lot of artists are insular. They work sequestered. You don't even know what they're doing until they ever show you stuff. The problem with sculpture, particularly art for public places, is that it's not in the curriculum. It's not in high school curriculums, and public art is not a curriculum in college. You don't go to school to become a public artist. You choose it. It's a calling. You have a gift. Question is, can you use that gift to make art for public places? There's no school for that. There isn't. And so it's a very unusual arena. And unless you meet somebody who's in that arena, or you learn about that arena, or you see a call for something, you decide that you want to try for that arena, you don't know nothing about this arena. So one of the nice things about me being me is I make people aware that the arena even exists. That's the first thing. It's like, you need to know this is an opportunity. Like, for instance, I have fifth graders coming here from the Pearl School. Pearl School here in Yonkers is a school for the gifted. These kids come in here with the phones up. Every last one of them has a phone, and they're real smart. This is 11 years old. And I like to tell them, yeah, I live here. When you're not here, it's my living room. I got an 8-foot woman in my living room. Yeah, that's how I live. And that's my bedroom up there. Yeah, I live here. And you know what? I like not having to leave my house when it snows in the wintertime. I like getting up when I feel like it. I like controlling my time. This is what I'm living for. I decide when I go to work. I decide if I want to work into the night. I decide when I want to take the day off and go to the beach. I decide. I run things around here. If you like controlling yourself like that, think about becoming self-employed as an artist. But it's not easy, because that beginning part is a whip, because you got to bust your ass. You know, in the early years, you know, my mentor said to me, oh, Bags, you know, you got to stack your jobs. You know, you got to put irons in the fire. You just can't have one iron. And I understood the concept, but it wasn't happening. And at some point I realized, and I got it basically from, I sold mortgages at some point, I had to make over 100 phone calls a day to get 4 people to actually let me get an application, and hope that one of those applications closed. It's a crapshoot, throwing shit on the wall and seeing what sticks. The question is, do you have that temperament to do that? A lot of people are like, no, give me a job. My daughter was like that. And that was the point I was making with the story earlier. My daughter is a phenomenal talent, but she said she needs a sustainable job. That's what she calls it. I'm like, what in the world is a sustainable job? Well, you have a job. I said, oh, girl, there's no such thing as security when you have a job and work for other people. She picked an arena that she thought would be sustainable. People are going to have babies. They are. So my daughter delivers babies for a living. That's her day job. And we're always going to want nurses because nurses are smarter than doctors. But the point of it is that she did not want to be a freelancer. And the question is, when you talk about these new young women, the millennials and the ones before them, the question is, how compelled are you? Not motivated, compelled, because this is a compulsion. This is OCT. This is what it looks like. I don't have a choice. And I think most artists who work as artists feel pretty much that way. Like, this is just what I do. And when we try to do other things, the other things don't work as well. This is the superpower. Some of us have more than one, but the bottom line is at some point you realize you need to use a superpower because the other shit is not working.
So in the whole of this process then of your work and this compulsion to do what you do, where is the satisfaction in it? Is it when you stand back when your statue is finished? When it gets in the public domain?
No, it's not important. That's not important. What's important is that I experienced the process of making. It's nice to have the public art and, finished and the hugs and the kisses and the cheers and stuff. But the important part is the actual making of the work. That part.
That is success to you, is it?
Yes, the fact that I get a chance to actually do it. And then, of course, it works. I understand. I have not been to school for this. I just do this and it works. Somebody said to me, well, how do you know it's going to work? It's like, again, kind of like I say, you get up and go to the mailbox and you can, you will, and you do.
What would you tell your teenage self then about the journey that you've had and how you were so committed?
I wouldn't tell her anything. But she like, oh, fuck that. I'm not doing any of that. That sounds hard. No. What? Are you serious? Is that the plan? Is there some place where I can barter for a different path? Because no, it was a very difficult path. I mean, from the door.
What's your parents' reaction to your success?
Oh, my father is my biggest fan and my mother's just like, so what? I mean, but my dad also was an artist, a visual artist. My father could paint, he went to school for drafting. He couldn't be a draftsman because of racism. But the point of it is that he had an ability and he loved it that I had it too. My mother also had an ability. My mother also can draw and paint. My mother was a nurse. I believe that art really is a gene, that certain abilities are passed down and sometimes you get them. And the question is, what do you do with the gift? My premise is you give it back.
Where does music fit in your life?
Oh, my goodness. Music's like the backstory of my life. My mother and my mother's mother believed in high fidelity stereos. So I grew up with hi-fis, as we used to call them. My mother was one of the first people in the world, I swear to God, no lie. She was one of the first people to have that quadraphonic stereo system where you had the 4 speakers. And when you stood in the middle of the 4 speakers, you felt like you were there. Again, my mother was very much into music. So music played on Saturdays for sure, like all day. As I grew up, there was always music. Now, in the old days, as we used to say, here in New York, we had WABC with Cousin Brucey. He didn't play black music. Occasionally you might hear the Supremes and the Temptations. Amazingly, you never heard Smokey Robinson. You might hear Marvin Gaye. That's it. But there was a whole bunch of other performers that I heard, and I learned about music in Brooklyn. I had cousins who lived in Brooklyn. These are New York City people. These are fast kids. They know stuff. We used to go down the street on Eastern Parkway with a juke joint, and the guy would let us put wooden niggles in his jukebox to play music all day. So I loved going to Brooklyn. We used to go there at least twice a year. And then, of course, at some point, I was given my own little stereo where I could play my music the way I wanted to play. My grandmother was into spirituals. My other grandmother, my father's mother. So when I went to the South, there was no secular music on Sundays. You only get to play the spirituals. So I learned spirituals. So I love James Cleveland. And of course, later here comes Aretha Franklin and James Cleveland. And, you just this is culture. And then, of course, as time goes on, in high school, I dated a guy 3 years my senior, and he was a DJ. So he introduced me to music. I remember the first time I heard Earth, Wind, and Fire. He put it on. He's like, "Oh, you're gonna love this. Listen to this. Listen to this." There was a lot of stuff that I learned through him, and then of course, as time went on, the radio stations evolved, and there was WLIB. I remember I broke my leg when I was 13. I got hit by a car, and I've been going to church every Sunday till I was 13 because that's my parents required. And when I came back from the hospital, because I was in the hospital for almost a year, my mother would let me stay home and listen to Farrakhan on Sunday. And again, my mother had me reading Malcolm X when I was 10. In the early 80s, we had really amazing jazz station here in New York. We had WRVR, and Les Davis, who was the DJ then, taught you jazz history, which was interesting. And on Saturdays, we still have it. WBGO comes out of New Jersey, where they do R&B. And of course, the fun thing about that program is that he doesn't just play the music. He gives you the background on the people who made the music. So again, having grown up with the music that he's playing, some of what he is saying I know, and some is like, oh, I did not know that. Wow. Okay. And so music is kind of like the background, like anybody else's life. You put a song on from 1970, been like, oh my God, the Temprees. Remember that song? We skipped school because you were dating that guy. Remember him? It just, music has that kind of power. When I was writing, I had a playlist. I still have the playlist. I play it every now and then. I used to have a playlist, songs, because there was a period when rap first came in. I was not into rap. I understood rap. Rap was not brand new when it became popular. Rap was old in the Black community. They was signifying that was before rap. Point of it is that I couldn't listen to it on the radio. So I just started making my own playlists. And so, if I wanted to get into writing, I would put on a particular playlist. And then later it occurred to me, if you're going to sculpt, you should play a playlist. Like, of course, now I sculpt in silence, but there was a time when music was a prompt. It's kind of like a nice segue, like just to kind of get in the mood, so to speak.
And being a woman of words and a storyteller and a writer, I'm wondering what you read. What's on your bookshelves? What would we find?
Oh my goodness. At the moment, I'm in the middle of collecting books about slavery, Black children's books. Like, for instance, last year I bought a boatload of books that were illustrated by Jerry Pinkney. Jerry Pinkney lived here in Westchester. I met him when I was much younger. And I love his illustrations, and I find his stuff inspiring. At this point, I just picked up a book called Color of Law, and it's about, racism in the law. I'm interested in delving into that. I haven't started yet. It just came the other day. Sometimes, like, for instance, at the turn of the century, I was reading a lot of self-help books, that I recommend highly, like You Have to Read The Intuitive Way by Penny Pierce.
So what is your final analysis of your life then, Vinnie?
I'm here on purpose. I pray there's an afterlife. I really want to high five somebody on the other side. I swear to God. I swear, I want to step up and like, somebody give me a fucking, pardon my French, high five because I did that, okay? Seriously, this is a rip of a ride. And most of the people that I know are in the advanced class. We're all howling right about in through here. Like, what in the frickin' world? There is so much stuff that was not presented in the curriculum or the syllabus.
This was not in the script, was it?
No, there's nothing that I would tell myself. There's nothing that I would tell myself, because at every age I knew it's like you just have to keep going.
We're going to stop with that thought because there's a lot of life lessons in that, Vinnie. And so thank you for all of them. And thank you so much for sharing your story, which is quite a journey. Long may it continue because it's wonderful what you've accomplished, how you've stood by your convictions and how you've represented yourself and people of color in this country and beyond, I'm sure. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Well, thank you for listening.
You can find a link to Vinnie's website and her social media in the show notes accompanying this episode. You can also follow us on social media at the AART Podcast on Instagram. That's art with 2 A's. And feel free, of course, to send us a DM on Instagram if you have any suggestions for guests. As always, we would love to hear from you if you have a moment to leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps our rankings and help others find the show. Thank you again to my guest, Vinnie Bagwell. I'll be back next week with another episode, so I hope you'll join me then.